answer right away. I just watched the way her thumb rubbed absently along the rim of her cup as if she was tracing something invisible. I wanted to be a writer, she said suddenly, a real one. Books, essays, play, something meaningful. But he told me I was too emotional, too indulgent. I didn't realize my hand had reached across the table until her fingers brushed mine. You're not doing anything, I said. You just stopped being listened to by the wrong person. Our hands didn't stay touching, but they didn't move far either. Eventually, she glanced at her phone and sighed. He's expecting me. I tried to hide my disappointment. Of course, she stood slowly, slipping on her coat, but she didn't rush. Before walking out, she looked over her shoulder and said, "You make me remember things I forgot I ever loved." And then she was gone. I sat there for a long time after staring at her untouched teacup, feeling like I'd just stepped into something I didn't fully understand but didn't want to walk away from either. I wasn't supposed to feel anything for her, but I did, and I wasn't ready to let it go. That was just the beginning, and there was much yet to come. It started with a text from a number I didn't recognize late on a Friday evening, just as I was about to crawl into bed. Then I got a text: "I shouldn't be reaching out, but I'm at the studio tonight. If you're nearby, the door's open." No name, no emoji, just that. But I knew it was her, Elena, and I also knew I should have ignored it. Instead, I was out the door in under 10 minutes, heart thudding in my throat as I threw on a hoodie and jeans. The streets were quieter than usual, cold wind rushing through the alleyways, leaves brushing the pavement like whispers, the kind of night that made secrets feel heavier, like they mattered more in the dark. Her studio was tucked behind a bookstore, almost invisible from the main road. It used to be a gallery. I remembered her saying she still used it sometimes, though no one came anymore. When I arrived, the door cracked open just as she'd said. The faintest amber light spilled into the courtyard. I hesitated only once, then stepped inside. She stood barefoot on the wooden floor, wearing an oversized sweater that reached her thighs. Her hair pulled back in a messy clip, a bottle of red wine set half drunk beside a pair of paintbrushes, the scent of turpentine faint in the air. Classical music played low from a dusty speaker, and just like that, the rest of the world dropped away. Her eyes met mine. "You came," she said, almost like she didn't expect me to. I didn't want to, but I couldn't not. That made her smile, a soft, sad little smile, like she was already regretting something she hadn't even done yet. "I've been painting," she said, motioning toward a half-finished canvas. It was abstract, dark strokes clashing with pale blue, like something beautiful trying to break through something angry. "It's intense," I murmured, stepping closer. "So is everything I'm feeling lately." I turned to look at her, and there it was again, that unbearable closeness, not in distance, but in energy, the kind that makes every part of your body hyper-aware of her voice, her breath, the way her fingers curled around her wine glass. "You didn't come here to talk about art, did you?" she asked quietly. I swallowed. Number. She took a step closer. Neither did I. The silence that followed felt alive, breathing between us, pressing against our chests. I could hear the ticking of the old wall clock, the shift of her weight on the wooden floorboards, but nothing sounded louder than my heartbeat. "I don't know what this is," I whispered. "Me neither," she replied, her voice barely audible. But then her hand brushed mine lightly, at first, then with purpose. Our fingers didn't intertwine, they just rested together, warm and uncertain. "If anyone saw us like this," I started. "They won't," she interrupted. "He doesn't even know I still come here." A pause, and then she said the quiet part out loud: "He doesn't care where I go anymore." There was pain in her voice, not dramatic, not broken, just the quiet ache of someone who'd been fading for too long and hadn't realized how invisible she'd become. "I care," I said before I could stop myself. She looked at me sharply, like that confession was more dangerous than anything else we'd said, but instead of pulling away, she reached up slowly, deliberately, and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. My breath caught. "Elena," I whispered. Her hand lingered against my cheek. "Tell me to stop," she said, but I didn't. I couldn't, because standing there in that quiet, half-lit room, surrounded by forgotten paintings and unopened wine bottles, she looked more alive than I'd ever seen her, and I felt more seen than I ever had. So I closed the space between us. It wasn't a kiss yet, just the suggestion of one, a breath apart, our lips hovering like magnets, not quite brave enough to touch, but everything in me leaned forward, drawn into her, craving the weight of her hands, the taste of her name on my tongue. She closed her eyes, and for a moment we just stood there, two women on opposite sides of a forbidden line, teetering. The first touch wasn't even lips, it was breath, hers trembling just slightly against mine, the kind of hesitation that feels more intimate than a kiss ever could. She was so close, I could see the fine lines beneath her eyes, the soft pink flush spreading across her chest, the faint tremor in her fingers as they hovered by my jaw, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to hold me. And then she did. Her hand slid behind my neck and pulled me in, not roughly, not confidently, but like someone who had fought this need for too long and finally stopped. Losing our mouths met in a kiss that wasn't slow or hesitant anymore. It was urgent, it was starving. We moved like we were making up for every time we'd walked away, every look we didn't hold, every message we never sent. Her lips parted and I kissed her deeper. She tasted like red wine and something softer, like silence, like sorrow, like the sweetness of being wanted after feeling invisible for too long. My hands cupped her waist and I felt her body melt into mine like she'd been waiting to fall into someone who wouldn't look away. The room felt too still, like the air had thickened around us. Every painting on the wall, every unfinished canvas, every faint brush stroke suddenly faded. There was only her and me and the secret we were about to turn into something we couldn't undo. Elena broke the kiss first, only to whisper something against my lips. "I can't believe I'm doing this." "Then stop me," I whispered back, even though I didn't want her to. But instead of stopping me, she kissed me again, harder this time, more desperate, her hands tangling in my hair as she pushed me gently toward the studio wall. The backs of my legs hit a stool and I let it fall. Our bodies collided, pressed chest to chest. I could feel her heart pounding as fast as mine, could feel her breath hitch as I slipped my fingers beneath the hem of her sweater and found warm bare skin. She gasped into my mouth but didn't pull away. "I shouldn't want this," she murmured. "But you do," I said, letting my hands explore the curve of her back, the dip of her waist. She nodded barely and her forehead rested against mine. "I haven't felt anything in so long." I kissed her again, slower this time, savoring the way she opened to me, the way her body arched into mine, the way her hand slid under my hoodie, her nails dragging softly along my spine. She pulled me across the studio, walking backward without breaking the kiss. We stumbled through shadows and past half-finished paintings until we reached a corner where a dusty old chaise sat beneath a faded window. She pulled me down with her, our bodies falling together in a mess of limbs and hurried hands. Clothes peeled away quietly, reverently. My sweater hit the floor, her sweater followed. She sat beneath me in only a bra and lace panties, her legs parting just enough to invite me in closer. Her skin was warm and smooth beneath my hands, her breath unsteady as I kissed along her collarbone, down her sternum, tasting every inch she offered me. She was trembling, so was I, but neither of us stopped when her bra fell away. I kissed the space between her breasts and felt her arch into me, her hands gripping my waist. When I slid my hand between her thighs, she gasped my name, not my full name, just the way it sounded when said in secret, said in need. "Amara." I kissed her again. "Say it like you mean it." "I do," she whispered. "God, I do." And when I finally touched her, really touched her, she bit her bottom lip and closed her eyes like she didn't want to cry, but might I kissed her through it, loved her through it, held her like she hadn't been held in years. Every part of her, every shiver, every moan, every desperate breath felt like a confession. She came undone in my hands, her head buried in my neck, her fingers digging into my back like she never wanted to let go, and I didn't want her to, not now, not ever. Afterward, we lay tangled on the chaise, our bodies warm, our breathing slowing. The room had gone silent again except for the storm outside tapping gently against the window pane. Her hand was still in mine. Her forehead rested against my shoulder. "I don't know how to go back after this," she said quietly. "Then don't," I whispered. "We don't have to." She didn't reply right away, but she didn't pull away either. Her thumb stroked slow circles on my palm like she was memorizing the shape of being wanted, and in that moment I knew one thing with aching clarity: we weren't just crossing a line, we were erasing it, and there was no turning back now. I didn't want to open my eyes. The morning light poured through the studio's high window, touching the tips of my eyelashes, warming my cheek where I rested against the quilt. I could smell oil paint, old wood, and faint traces of her perfume, that soft powdery scent that had clung to her collarbone. When I kissed it in the dark, I stayed still, eyes shut, pretending just for a few more seconds that the world hadn't returned yet, that last night hadn't passed, that this wasn't real. But it was. She shifted beside me, a small movement, barely a stir. Her breath hitched, and I felt the tension in her body before she even moved away. Slowly, Lelena rolled onto her back, creating a space between us, the same space we had burned down hours earlier. My arm slid off her waist like it didn't belong there anymore. I opened my eyes and watched the ceiling for a moment. My chest felt heavy. My limbs were warm under the blanket, but a cold unease had started curling beneath my skin. "Morning," I whispered, afraid to speak louder. She didn't answer right away. She was staring upward too, her profile framed in the silver blue morning haze. Her hair was messy, her lips slightly parted, and yet she looked distant, like she was already somewhere else, somewhere I couldn't follow. "Elena," I said again, softer this time. She blinked and turned her head toward me high. Her voice was fragile, like the smallest gust of truth would break her apart. I sat up, holding the quilt against my chest. She followed after a pause, drawing her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them like a girl trying to disappear into herself. I didn't sleep, she admitted. I not. She glanced down, avoiding my eyes because I didn't know what to feel and because I already knew I'd regret it. My stomach twisted. Do you? She looked at me, then really looked number, and that's what terrifies me. There was no accusation in her voice, no anger, just the kind of sadness that's carved slowly over time, the kind that lives beneath your ribs and only comes out in the quiet hours after everything's changed. I should go, she said, suddenly rising from the couch and scanning the room for her clothes. He'll notice I'm not home. He never notices, I said without thinking. That made her pause just briefly. Still, she murmured, it's better if he doesn't have a reason to ask questions. She picked up her sweater from the floor and slipped it over her head. I watched the hem fall back into place, covering the curve of her hips, the skin I had kissed only hours ago. Now she was dressing like none of it had happened, like we hadn't torn the air between us in two. Something electric and unforgivable. Elena, I said, standing too, can we just talk for a second? Her hands froze at the clasp of her bra. She closed her eyes. There's nothing left to say, Amara. We did what we weren't supposed to. It was wrong, but it didn't feel wrong. She let out a quiet, pained laugh. That's the problem. It felt more right than anything has in years. She turned to me then, eyes shining, not with tears, but with some aching truth neither of us could fully hold. You made me feel alive last night, she whispered, and I haven't felt that in a long time, but feeling alive doesn't make this okay. I'm not asking for a relationship or even a label. I just wanted to know you weren't alone in it. She finished for me. I nodded. You weren't, she said. But Amara, I have a life, a messy, complicated life tied to a man I may not love anymore, but who still has power over everything I do. My name, my finances, my entire world has been built around him. I took a step toward her, then tear it down. She laughed. Again, this time sadder. That's what people say when they've never had to rebuild from the ashes. The studio felt colder now. The air between us was no longer charged, it was haunted. I crossed my arms over my chest, not out of modesty, but to keep the ache in my chest from spilling over. So what was I asked. A break from your marriage? A distraction? No, she said instantly. You were the first thing that made me question whether I disappeared completely. That hurt more than anything else could have, because it meant I wasn't just a mistake, I was a mirror. She finished dressing in silence. I watched her fix her hair in the reflection of a broken picture frame. She looked polished again, composed, but something in her eyes had dimmed, like she'd already returned to the version of herself that had learned how to vanish when she turned to leave. I spoke without thinking. Would you do it again? She paused with her hand on the door. I shouldn't. That's not what I asked. She turned her face slightly, just enough for me to see her eyes. Yes, she said, but I'd hate myself for it afterward. And then she walked out, pulling the door closed behind her with a soft click that echoed too loud in the empty space she left behind. I stood there for a long time, still half naked, still warm with the scent of her, staring at the spot on the couch where we'd collapsed together, two women who didn't mean for this to happen but couldn't stop it either. I didn't go to class that day. I couldn't sit across from Professor Hartley and pretend like I hadn't touched the woman who shared his bed. I couldn't watch him scribble notes on the board while remembering the sound of her moan in my ear. Instead, I walked around the city, got lost in bookstores, wandered alleys with no destination, tried to scrub the memory from my hands like it was ink. But it clung to me. She clung to me, not just the way she tasted or the way her body responded to mine, but the way she looked at me, the way I saw her, really saw her, and I couldn't unsee it. Later that night, I found a plain, white envelope slipped into my campus mailbox. No name, no return address. Inside was a folded piece of thick gallery paper. In her handwriting, soft, slanted, familiar, was just one sentence. I've never wanted to be found so badly in my life. There was no explanation, no date, no next step, but I knew it was her, and I knew that whatever this thing was between us, it hadn't ended. Not really. Maybe it never would. Maybe some secrets don't stay buried. Maybe they grow roots in the silence and bloom in the spaces no one else dares to look. I tucked the note into my pocket and stepped back into the cold. Do you think if I could go back to that night, would I still let it happen? Would I still let myself kiss the one person I was never meant to touch? I don't know. Maybe I would, maybe I wouldn't change a thing. All I know is something shifted between us, something permanent. The way she looked at me when no one else was watching, that wasn't just loneliness, it was a choice. And now I don't even know what we are, his wife, my secret, or something we can never undo. If you think you understand it better than I do, leave a comment. She kissed me, her husband's student, right there in the studio, and I didn't stop her. I didn't want to, because once it happened, I knew we'd already crossed the line we could never come back from. It all started with a dinner I never wanted to attend. Just another faculty event, another night of forced smiles and stiff conversations. It was one of those endofter term formalities, a celebration for the department's most promising students, which basically meant the ones who showed up on time turned in decent papers and didn't piss off the wrong professor. I wasn't excited. I wasn't even sure why I'd agreed to come, but Professor Hartley had made it sound like skipping would be some kind of professional suicide, and I needed his recommendation next semester, so I showed up in a black dress that felt too formal, heels I immediately regretted, and a forced smile that stayed frozen until I walked through the banquet hall doors and saw her. At first, I didn't know who she was, just that she was breathtaking. There was a quiet kind of grace to the way she stood beside him, Professor Hartley, like she didn't quite belong in a room full of aging academics and brown-nosing students. Her dress was soft blue silk off-shoulder, and her dark hair was pulled into a loose twist at the nape of her neck. She looked elegant and aloof, like someone from another time. I watched her laugh politely at someone's joke, sip white wine, and glance towards the window like she couldn't wait to be anywhere else. Then she turned and caught me staring. Her eyes locked with mine for half a second, too long, just long enough to make my stomach tighten. She didn't look away immediately. She noticed me, not just the way people scan a crowd, they see everyone but connect with no one. Number, she saw me, and I felt it later after the speeches and the flat chicken and the too sweet cake. I ended up at a small table with her while Professor Hartley chatted with the department chair across the room. She sat across from me, legs crossed, sipping the last of her wine. Her presence was magnetic, like every moment around her stretched into something slower, heavier. "You're in his literature class, right?" she asked, nodding toward her husband. I hesitated. "Yeah. Monday mornings. Second row." "I thought so," she said. "You're the one who always challenges him. He complains about you over breakfast." I nearly choked. "Seriously?" A small smile tugged at her lips. "He says you're relentless, that you ask questions no one else thinks to ask." I blinked, surprised. "I thought he hated that." "Oh, he does," she replied lightly. "But it means he remembers you. Most students blur together for him." I looked down at my drink. "Well, I didn't mean to cause trouble." "You didn't," she said softly. "He just doesn't like being questioned. Most men like to be right more than they like to be understood." That line sat with me. There was a sharpness behind her softness, a quiet ache underneath the calm, and for reasons I couldn't explain, not even to myself, I wanted to know more. Not about him, not about their marriage, about her. She extended her hand after a moment. "I'm Elena." I took it. Her fingers were delicate, cold from the glass. "Nice to meet you. I'm Amara," she finished for me. "I know." I tilted my head, caught off guard. "You do? I've read one of your essays." He left it lying around at home. "You write like you're arguing with someone you love." I felt my face flush. "That's oddly accurate." She smiled again, then looked away, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "That's how I used to write." Used to. The way she said it, it wasn't casual. It was a quiet confession. I wanted to ask her what happened, why she stopped, what she'd written about before her life became faculty dinners and biting back opinions in the background. But Professor Hartley returned just then, placing a hand on her shoulder. Without looking at her, she flinched, not visibly, but I noticed she stiffened slightly, her smile fading just a little too quickly. It was subtle, but it hit me hard. He didn't introduce her to the others at our table, didn't glance her way while he rambled about academic politics. She was an accessory to him, an extension of his image, and I suddenly hated how invisible she seemed to everyone else except me. After the dinner ended, we all began to drift toward the exit. I moved slower than necessary, hoping she might too. She was a few steps behind her husband, still looking distracted, eyes unfocused. I found the courage to walk up beside her. "You said you used to write. What stopped you?" She looked at me, surprised by the directness. For a moment, I thought she wouldn't answer, but then she whispered, "Sometimes you forget who you were before you became someone's shadow." And then she smiled. Not the poised kind she'd worn all night, but something softer, sadder. "Good night, Amara," she said, and turned to follow him to their car. I stood there under the yellow glow of the parking lot lights, watching her silhouette fade into the darkness, something turning over inside me like a secret I didn't know I had. I couldn't stop thinking about her that night, not about the dress or the smile or the way she saw me through a room full of people. No, it was the sadness in her voice, the way she said she used to write, like it had once been a lifeline, and now she didn't even try. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know what it was, but I knew this: I wanted to see her again, and this time I wouldn't just wait around for coincidence to bring her back. Then I knew something was happening between us. I kept telling myself it was nothing. A fleeting conversation, a moment of misplaced connection, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw her Ilna in that soft blue silk saying things people don't usually say to strangers, and that look in her eyes when she said she used to write it haunted me more than I wanted to admit. So when I saw her again 3 days later, standing alone in the art aisle of the campus bookstore, it didn't feel like a coincidence. It felt like fate giving me a second chance I hadn't earned. She was wearing a cream sweater tucked into dark jeans, her hair down, this time falling in gentle waves over her shoulders. One hand was tucked under her chin as she read the back of a poetry collection, completely unaware of anyone else in the world. My feet moved before my brain caught up. By the time I stood beside her, pretending to browse a shelf I didn't care about, I was already replaying every word I wanted to say. She looked up and smiled like we'd planned this all along. Didn't think I'd see you here, same, I said, except I kind of hoped I would. Her brow lifted, just a little, curious, maybe even amused. Looking for more metaphors to argue about, maybe? Or just someone who actually understands them. She laughed, quiet and genuine, and I felt it bloom inside my chest like warmth I hadn't realized I'd been missing. She slid the book back onto the shelf and turned fully to face me. Coffee, she asked, no hesitation, no polite excuse about being busy. I nodded definitely. We walked in silence at first, the air between us filled with something heavier than words. The cafe was only a few blocks away, but the way she brushed her hair behind her ear when she glanced at me, the way our arms almost touched as we turned corners, it made the walk feel like a question neither of us was brave enough to ask. We settled into a small booth in the far corner of the cafe, dim lighting, a low hum of conversation around us. She ordered chamomile tea. I stuck with black coffee. I watched the way her fingers wrapped around the mug, her knuckles pale from the chill outside. So, she said finally, how's the great Professor Hartley treating you? I smirked like an obstacle he wishes would vanish. She smiled into her tea. He doesn't know what to do with someone who thinks faster than he does. It unsettles him. He seems intense. He is, she said, and for the first time her voice didn't hide the exhaustion behind her words. In every way, loud, charismatic, brilliant when he wants to be, but always needing to be the center of the room. I stayed quiet, letting her speak. She didn't feel the silence for my sake. She filled it like someone who'd been quiet too long and forgot how much she needed to be heard. He wasn't always like that. She continued softly. When we first met, he was curious, passionate. He made me feel like I mattered, and then somewhere along the way it shifted. I became the person in the background clapping for his success. You still matter, I said before I could stop myself. She looked up, her eyes green. I realized now searched mine like she didn't know what to do with that sentence. Then she smiled, not politely but softly, gratefully. Thank you. The silence stretched again, but it wasn't awkward. It was warm, charged. She leaned back, her eyes narrowing playfully. You write like someone who lives too much inside her head. I do live there. It's quieter, fewer people to disappoint. That's not true, she said. You disappoint people the moment you stop living out loud. That line, it hit me too hard to true. I didn't